Hi, I'm Elizabeth Whitten, the author of Off Panel, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Elizabeth Whitten about writing Off Panel from Engen Books. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Elizabeth Whitten is a freelance reporter based in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. She received her master's in anthropology in 2012 from Memorial University. Instead of heading off to do her PhD, she moved to Halifax to attend University of King's College one-year Bachelor of Journalism. From there, she was Down Home Magazine's assistant editor for 4 years, before heading to the Daily News with All Newfoundland and Labrador, where she covered the tech sector and healthcare. In the summer of 2021, she decided to become a full-time freelance reporter. Her work has been published by CBC, Atlantic Business Magazine, and Horizons. She's also the Independent's investigative reporter and has a weekly column called What Odds at City Hall. Her new book, Off Panel, about the history of Newfoundland and Labrador comics, is published by Engen Books. Off Panel is a collection of essays that introduce the major figures in the local Newfoundland and Labrador comic book scene and how they became interested in comics, the challenges of working in the province, the themes they write about, and what inspires them. The book also delves into details about how comic books have changed in the past few decades, both in the technology available to artists like the iPad and publishing mediums, including the internet. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Elizabeth Whitten about writing Off Panel from Engen Books. So, Elizabeth Whitten, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Appreciate your time. Before we get started with all the questions, I'm going to ask you a question I ask most people on this podcast is, what was the first comic book that you read?
I would say I didn't gravitate immediately to North American comics. Like, I grew up watching, like, Batman, the animated series, the Spider-Man series from the 90s, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but those are all, like, television things. But actually, I think it was Tintin. I remember reading it in, like, elementary and junior high, especially the French ones, because I was in French immersion for a few years. If you finished your coursework fast enough, you were allowed to go and read some of the French comic books, and they had asterisks, but I really liked Tintin. So I think it was actually Tintin.
That's cool. Hergé is a great inspiration for folks, that's for sure. You're not, let's say, a typical, let's say, target for this podcast when it comes to comic book creators. You're actually a writer and reporter. So I wonder if you could explain before we get going what you do for a living.
Well, I am a reporter in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. I kind of came to journalism a bit in an odd way. I was really focused on becoming an academic, and I did my master's in anthropology, and I really loved research, but I kind of had like a crisis of like, where's my career going? Do I want to be a professor? And I really liked writing, so I started doing some freelance writing for the local paper here. I applied to journalism school at the University of King's College in Halifax. So I did that in 2014, 2015. And then I got a job as a magazine editor. I was an assistant editor for a local magazine called Down Home for about 4 years. Then I made the change to become a business reporter with a site called All Newfoundland and Labrador. And I freelanced for a bit after that. And that's when I actually wrote Off Panel, my book. And now I'm currently with the CBC. And throughout my time as a reporter, I often wrote about comic books. I wrote a few articles about it for this short-lived but wonderful alternative newspaper called The Overcast. I wrote an article about a comic book that was in production, and it still is, for a magazine called Newfoundland Quarterly, and a few for the CBC. So a few writers you might know of interviewed on your podcast, like Kevin Woolridge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some good folks there. Yeah. So speaking about that, you just mentioned your new book, Off Panel. I wonder if you could talk a wee bit about it, maybe how it came to be and what inspired you to create it.
I was inspired a little over a year ago. It came together, the pitch came together really quickly. I was writing an article for Quill and Choir, and it was about a local book publisher called Engen Books and how they were branching out into nonfiction. And Matthew, one of the founders of the company that I interviewed, kind of made this offhanded comment about how they didn't know like what type of nonfiction they were going to go for, like maybe the history of indie comics in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that kind of just like was an instant like, oh, that would be a good book. And then I pitched the idea of like the history of Newfoundland and Labrador comics to the CBC as a freelance piece. So I interviewed 3 creators for that piece, and it was Wallace Ryan, Paul Tucker, and Kelly Bastow. And in my mind, even though I was pitching it as an article, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, if I find enough titles, enough creators in my research for this article, and this has a really good reception when the article comes out, I'd really like to dive into this as a book. And I obviously knew exactly who I was going to take it to. I was going to take it to Engen Books. And so I used the article as a way to jump off to show the publisher that I was the right person to write this book. And I also had interviewed comic book artists throughout the years, so I knew a bunch of them already. And the article had such a great reception that I knew that, oh, readers would like to hear more about this too. So I pitched it to Engen Books. They accepted it, and I gave myself about 5 to 6 months to write it. And it just kept on getting bigger and bigger. At the start, I thought it would be like 12 people maybe. And then I just kind of kept on like growing it and finding new people.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, there's a lot of talent in Newfoundland that people don't typically think of being a haven of comic book creators. That's for sure. What sort of feedback did you get? Typically, most people think of St. John's being the hotbed, but did you find creators across Newfoundland and Labrador, or were they all sort of in one place?
A lot of them are in St. John's because it's basically, if you want to go to school, you mostly have to come to St. John's. There's a few college campuses across the province, but it's kind of where a lot of the jobs are, and a lot of where the cultural like hotbed is, and unfortunately. But there are people throughout the province. Some have left, so I had to track down those people, but a lot were in St. John's. A lot of them aren't making comics anymore, so I was just asking them about like their memories of making comics. There was this newspaper called The Scope. It actually had a local comic book section. So I kind of interviewed a handful of creators from that era. Yeah, it is a lot in St. John's. Some people from the West Coast, they're not even living in the province anymore. The farthest in Canada I ended up interviewing someone was in British Columbia, and someone's actually in South Korea. So I had to get up at like 6 a.m. to interview him and be ready for it was a 7 p.m. interview on my end, but like 7:30 in the evening for him.
Right. Yeah. All over the place. That's for sure. That's for sure. Did you find there was any common threads to these folks when they were talking about their stories and their creative process? Did you find some undercurrent?
Thematically, they write about such different topics. I was really blown away by the breadth of it. So you have people doing like a lot of autobiographical comics, but not always. Some people will do comic based on their lives, whereas some people really like fantasy. There's science fiction. Yeah, like not many superheroes.
Right. Yeah. That's typically a thing in independent comics. I think people like to write about stuff that's close to the vest, so to speak, and get away from the Batman, Superman type of thing.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
One really famous indie comic was created by Wallace Ryan and Todd Livingstone, and it's called Toxic, and it was published 2 issues in 1990, and it's a parody of Cerberus the Aardvark because it has a character, a noir detective called Sherlock Platypus, and he's on the cover, and also the Forgery Four, which is a Fantastic Four parody. So it was very tongue in cheek, kind of poking fun at those kind of tropes in comics of
Right.
of the superhero genre. But
Ah.
yeah, not a lot of superheroes.
Was there one aspect that really surprised you when you're doing all these interviews? Did someone come out and say something that shocked you, and you had no idea that this had happened in Newfoundland Labrador comics history?
I think the big thing that surprised me is that I'd done my fair bit of research trying to find other people who'd written about comics, and I'd interviewed Wallace Ryan before. So one of the first comic book made in Newfoundland and Labrador was a comic book, kind of heavy metal inspired comic anthology called Zeitgeist. And it was created by two teenagers, and that was Wallace Ryan and his friend Jerry Porter, who has since passed, unfortunately. But the common reoccurring date I kept on seeing was that Zeitgeist came out in January of 1979. And even if you get your hands on a copy of issue one, there were two volumes, excuse me. Volume one will say this came out in January of 1979. But I found a little letter in a student newspaper saying it came out in December of 1978. So that was kind of like the biggest surprise for me. So it was only by a few weeks difference, really. Even when I had interviewed Wallace Ryan for the TBC article that kind of became the book, he said, like, yeah, January 79 when it came out. But I actually ended up rewriting a bit of what we thought was like kind of established Newfoundland and Labrador comic book history. So that was the surprising thing. The other surprising thing, I think, was how backbreaking labor making comics can be, especially for the people who do it as a profession. Like a lot of the people here I interviewed, they just kind of did it as a side gig. It was this fun little artistic thing they did. And that is a totally valid way to approach comics. But the people who do this as on a professional level talk about how, it would be a lot of really hard deadlines to meet. And afterwards, they would be basically unable to move their arm for several days. It was backbreaking labor, as they described it.
Wow, that is something. Now, as you mentioned, we've both interviewed several people that are in the book and creators across Newfoundland. And after highlighting all the talent, I'm just astounded that there hasn't been a comic arts festival. We've seen it in other provinces, and I'm just wanted to get your take on your thoughts. Do you think that now that it's sort of bubbling up and there's more creators coming out of the woodwork, do you think that Newfoundland and perhaps St. John's can support a comic arts festival?
Well, we technically had one. It was called Pure Comics Festival, and it only had 1 year because it was 2019, and then I think we all remember what happened in 2020. But it was a comics festival. It wasn't so much for comic book creators like what I think of TCAF, but it was organized by Wallace Ryan and Paul Tucker, and they basically hosted a bunch of workshops. Some of them was about scripting, like how to script a comic book, which was hosted by Andrew Hawthorne, another person I interviewed in the book. There was a little tiny market, but it really wasn't like when I see like the Montreal has a comic festival or Dartmouth just had one, and TCAF, of course. Yeah, I'd really like to see one happen. I really hope we do get one because I think that would be really fun. We do have other conventions. We have like Sci-Fi on the Rock, which isn't, it's a science fiction fantasy convention.
Yeah, well, maybe one day we'll keep our fingers crossed and see what happens.
Yeah. What I got when I was interviewing people is that a lot of the comic book creators, they know each other. They know each other from school. Like Andrew Hawthorne and Kevin Woolridge went to high school together. And some of them went off to college, met in college, and then they went off on their own, trajectories and then ended up making comics. But a lot of it is like, it's a very solitary activity. Some people do like to kind of gather in groups. There's something called the Comic Book Jam here in St. John's. And so it's hosted once a month and people can kind of get together. They can do their own critiques. They can just hang out and draw, listen to music and eat some snacks. But it's something you can basically do completely in solitary. So I think because there's no organization, like a professional organization maybe, or like a nonprofit or a volunteer group. So maybe there's like, it doesn't draw them all together the same way like other bigger cities have.
Right. No, that makes sense. Well, we'll see how it goes. That's for sure. Now, I've been asking creators about the use of AI in comic book creation. So I know you're not a comic book creator, but I want to get your take. Do you think that AI is helpful or harmful to the creative process? Let's say, for example, like writing books or writing reports or articles. What's your take on it?
It's theft. Like, it's not even artificial intelligence. It's just a program that steals other artists' work. Like, why would anyone dedicate years and years of storytelling and artistic development if it's just going to be stolen and repurposed by someone else? Like, artists, one, deserve to be paid and they deserve to get credit for their work. And these programs are, just zapping that away. It's theft. Like, I'm
Right.
a reporter, and we're talking about how AI is, creeping into our own work, and we got to fight that.
Okay, very valid point, that's for sure. Now, we've been talking about Off Panel. The book is out now. I'm wondering if you have any other up-and-coming projects that you can talk about.
For the past 5, 6 years, I've been working on a biography on a doctor from my province who served in World War One. It's very different from Off Panel because it's a nonfiction historical book that follows the biography of Dr. Quinny McPherson and how he came to invent the gas mask. And actually, I was supposed to be working on that book, and instead kind of got wrapped up in Off Panel because I thought, oh, this biography is taking me forever to write and I'm hitting a few roadblocks. What if I wrote a different book? That would be fun.
Yes.
So that's still very much a work in progress.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, we've been talking about a lot of different projects you're working on. Wonder if you have a website that you recommend people go to find about your current and your future projects.
Yeah, I do. It's a WordPress site. It's ElizabethWhitten.ca. So ElizabethWhitten.ca. And I just spent the weekend updating it and including a section for my book where people can find it and order it, and samples of my work. So I've been working on that just to make sure when readers see my web address, they can have something to go look at.
Sounds good. Well, Elizabeth, those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
I really hope when people pick up this book, I hope it's Newfoundland and Labrador focused, but I hope it kind of, spans the country, because I think Newfoundland and Labrador is, as one creator I spoke with said, Newfoundland and Labrador really punches above its weight artistically. We have so many amazing creators that no one has ever heard of, but they really should know about. And, sometimes it's not even, we have so many interesting sci-fi shows, writers. I'm working on a bunch of different levels. We have a really strong indie presence, but we have, creators who've, published works with Aftershock, which was Clans of Bellari by Rob and Peter Blackie, who actually work in television. They pitched a science fiction series about 2 years ago, and it's out now. One of the interesting things that came up in the book was that I would finish a chapter and then someone would start a company like Kevin Woolridge did. He started Heavy Sweater Comics so that he could publish comics. And that happened months after I interviewed him. So I kind of had to go back and re-interview him again. And now he's actually going to be publishing the comics of another person I interviewed in the book. So I really like that, this is why I called my book, it's Off Panel, A History of Newfoundland and Labrador Comics, not the history, because it keeps on changing, and that's really exciting to see.
Thanks to Elizabeth for the chat. You can discover more about Elizabeth online at ElizabethWhitten.ca, and that's WHITTEN. Thanks for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. And if you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2023.